Hey, all right. So week 9, we're getting there. We're getting there. I hope you're all doing well. This week the theme continues along the lines of experience, right? The question of experience, how that is supposed to relate to a critical theory of oppression of the sort that feminism is in need of, basically, and in need of, we can think, in terms of responding to problems of silencing, basically. What we saw last time then with Scott and Oksala was that things aren't so straightforward, I suppose. Kind of intuitively, we might just think that kind of ordinary experience does provide the basis or foundation for our critical analyses of oppression, for example. Scott takes a fairly strong line against that, and that has something to recommend it, I suppose, in certain respects, but you might agree more, I personally do, with Oksala, where we think, well, that kind of conclusion seems a little misguided. Yet, don't forget, even Oksala will say that, well, experience doesn't play any kind of foundational role in any straightforward way, that all experience is mediated, all experience within the context of sexist oppression is kind of partly bound up with that. So there's no sort of simple, straightforward response to the problems, that we think of in terms of silencing. And so what we really want to do is just think a little bit more about how to bridge the kind of gap between, on the one hand, lived individual experience, which is surely important, but try to show how that kind of relates with a critical analysis of oppression. And so we have two texts basically this week, two fairly well-known, widely read texts, one from Nancy Hartsock, which is a little older, and the other from Patricia Hill Collins. They have a lot in common. There's a lot of similar points, and I'll probably just talk about those kind of at the same time, basically, in terms of how they have things in common, and then perhaps just touch on the end in some ways how they differ. But in both cases, they're talking about what we call a standpoint. So this is going to be a certain way of thinking about how we bridge that gap between our lived experience on the one hand and how it fits into a critical analysis of oppression on the other hand, basically in terms of working out a standpoint, that there's something important, this is the key thing in both cases, about experience, how we experience reality, and basically what we might say about it is always dependent. This is just true for everyone. Is always dependent basically on the point from which, kind of like your standpoint, from which you are perceiving or experiencing things, basically. In a sense, they want to talk about it saying like your social position, how you are located in society, is going to make a difference to how and what you experience and the conclusions you might be inclined to draw about reality. So that's sort of a basic kind of epistemological claim. So epistemological, right, meaning relating to questions about knowledge. That's always really dependent upon your position. This is sort of true in a very general sense if you just think about different perspectives that people can have. If you're standing on one side or the other of a certain object, things will appear differently. It's kind of that idea just taken up a few notches in terms of different positions within society that is indeed divided or stratified along lines of oppression. So that's kind of a basic kind of point. Although what comes out of this is their shared view that some standpoints are going to be epistemically better, that is to say, or they put it epistemically privileged, that is to say, better, afford a better view of reality, a more insightful one. And generally this correlates sort of inversely with one's sort of degree of, just say, social privilege. So usually we use the word in a critical sense in feminist and other kinds of discourses. Privileged positions typically were the ones that were like unjustly privileged or socially advantaged in many different ways. Here we're talking about a kind of epistemic privilege, that is a kind of insight, a more accurate understanding of what is actually going on in society, that this actually goes along generally with sort of how disadvantaged one is, actually. That's generally the claim that they are making. In each case, they want to think about this in very concrete terms or material terms. Hartsock emphasizes that term. And that is basically when we're thinking about people's lives, what people actually do, the forms of activity they're engaged in. Hartsock kind of emphasizes labor, and actually it comes up a lot in Collins as well in terms of what we might think of as labor. But we can just think more generally in terms of the actual concrete activities that different people are engaged in. That in virtue of that, people are going to have different views, different understandings of the world around them. And then the crucial thing is that some of these views are better, right? Actually more insightful than others. So we can think of this, in a way, we can relate it to Scott. When Scott was saying what we really need to do is shift our attention to the forms of discourse in terms of which, or through which, rather, our experience is mediated to really get a handle on what's going on. It's kind of like that, but in a more concrete sense. It's not so much this sort of more abstract sense of discursive forms or conceptual structures, but actually forms of activity, the real concrete stuff that people are engaged in life. Think about it in those terms, and we might come up with, the same kind of result, only hopefully a better one still. The most important point, or another very important point at any rate, is that this is not the same thing as just a perspective. Sometimes we can use that word in this connection, but probably it's best to reserve the word perspective when we're thinking about kind of individuals and their own experience, which is never ever exactly the same, of course, and there's all kinds of variability. But what Hartsock and Collins are really after when we're talking about a standpoint is precisely not to just get caught up in all of that, but try to work out from that a more theoretically developed view of the common structures of a certain group's experience. Every individual within those groups, whether it's women in general, which Hartsock is kind of talking about, or black women, which is the focus of Collins' discussion, as Collins emphasizes more than Hartsock, there is a lot of difference in there. There's a lot of different responses to the circumstances those people find themselves in, basically. But still, there's a kind of common structure, something that's really important, and it would be very useful for every one of those individuals to kind of be made aware of that. It's really hard for any individual herself to come up with this. It just doesn't happen. So arriving at and kind of developing or articulating a standpoint that is in common to a certain group, it's a very special effort, takes a lot of work. Right, trying to kind of synthesize a lot of different experiences and try to distill and bring out what is kind of the same amongst them. That's the crucial effort here. So it comes out of experience. It's very closely tied to experience, but it's never ever simply the direct reflection of experience. One way we can think about how it relates to individual experience is in terms of, kind of providing a better way to deal with issues about silencing. So just for example, what I'm thinking of right now when we think about the things Bartke was talking about in terms of psychological oppression and the double bind situation and how so often that can lead to situations of self-blaming. The idea is that when some people, some feminists say, come along and put in this effort to kind of develop and articulate a standpoint, the idea is that can sort of go back to, everyone else, ordinary living individuals experiencing the world, and kind of help them make better sense of that. It's almost like an antidote to that kind of self-blaming, or to kind of just see those situations of double binds as what they are, for example, and it can be very helpful and progressive in that sense. So, the broader point of it, of course, is to be a tool, a very important kind of tool in terms of making progress in eliminating and overcoming these situations of oppression. Now, from our perspective today, when we look at Hartsock, for example, we might think that she's being a little simplistic. She was kind of talking about just a woman's standpoint overall. Partly her piece predates a lot of thought about intersectionality. She does admit, okay, I'm not taking some of these other issues into consideration. But from our perspective today, we would think, well, you probably shouldn't bother then, just kind of in any event. So we could think that it's a little naive, perhaps, in terms of that. But still, it lays out some of the thoughts, some of the points fairly well. And what we can see in Collins, for example, is basically a more stepped up view that does take into account the complexities of oppression, basically, and thinking about these in intersectional terms. And the difference we might see, we're going to come back to this in different ways over the coming weeks as well, is on the one hand, someone like Hartsock does still seem to be thinking that the standpoint that she has in mind could have more or less served a kind of foundational role, and that could be a problem. We might think that's not going to quite work out. Whereas Collins isn't really pushing it in that direction exactly. She's thinking it's very important, for certain groups, and she's thinking about black women in particular here, to be able to, have their experience re-articulated in these standpoint terms. That's a very useful thing. It's not so much just the end in itself, though, is that sort of going to put them into a position to more effectively work together with other people, other groups, and so on, toward common goals of eliminating oppression. So those are the ways that Collins was talking about kind of coalition building, right? That this is just going to a good basis for then kind of working alongside other people who perhaps are approaching things in terms of their own standpoints and so on. Which is a very different thing from seeing it playing a foundational role. So we're going to have more to say about that in coming weeks for sure. For now, just try to grapple with these texts, see what they're working with, and keep up with everything else. And I'm going to just sign off for now because I've talked over 11 minutes.